Um, Southern Gulf Island Community Justice Program continues to grow, and we're learning so much along the way. We are very committed to the circle process, and then sociocracy allows us to look at the circle process in more of a institutional way, I guess, and being able to apply this to places where normally we have Robert's Rules of Order, where we have dualities. This is a way of working together as a group, as a circle, as a community, where all voices can be heard and all voices can have input in a safe and respectful way. So I'm very excited to be here and to have Ben, with his background in sociocracy and in group dynamics, to be able to present this to us. So thank you all for being here, and I will turn it over to Ben.
Well, thanks, Jim. And yes, thank you all for coming. And this is unlike most everything I do. I try to make it as interactive as possible. But tonight's going to be kind of old school with a PowerPoint presentation. And actually, I'm going to ask that you hold questions until the end, because I think there are some concepts that may be confusing when we start off, but they will make more sense by the end.
Oh, thank you.
So if you sort of just hold your comments, you might want to have a notepad nearby so that you can write down any questions that might come up for you, or any points that you want to remember. And hopefully then we'll get through the presentation in, we'll see, I'm aiming for half an hour to 45 minutes. And then the rest of the time will all be for questions and comments and thoughts about sociocracy. So I'm going to start off by saying my preferred form or flavor of sociocracy is called Sociocracy 3.0. There are a lot of different flavors of sociocracy or similar forms out there, and they mostly say similar things. So if you've seen Sociocracy for All or have had any of Ted Rao's training, then that's a really good model. And so I don't have bad things to say about the other flavors. They all have kind of the core philosophy and principles and practices. The reason I like Sociocracy 3.0 in part is because they are Creative Commons licensed. So all of their materials are free to use and adapt and share. And so that's actually tonight, I'm really leaning into their resources. So I like that feature of it. But like I said, all of the forms have value and have similar themes. There's just slight different emphasis and ways of saying things. So who is this workshop for? I'm focused on change makers, people who are trying to do their part to make the world a better place. And in particular, people who want to work in really collaborative peer-to-peer teams. If you believe, like I do, that when we collaborate well together, we are so much more effective. It's just a trick sometimes to figure out how to bring that true collaboration together. And so the goal in all of this, in applying sociocratic principles, there's 4 big things that I think are advantages of this way of working. One is there's much more resilience built into this system. It's more robust. It's more adaptable. And so it really adds to our collective resilience. It emphasizes collective learning. And one of the things I have come to believe is all of us are smarter than any of us know. And a lot of times we don't take the time to actually reflect on what we have learned, what's already working, what we know is true. And sociocracy provides ample opportunities for that to happen in a collective way. So we can draw together all that we know, and then we're just working a lot smarter together. It also builds in its DNA is social support. It creates supportive environments. So much like the circle process creates conversations that can sort of bring out a different quality in that conversation, sociocracy and its application allows you to work in that different feel. So it still gets things done, It's still aimed at practical work in the world, but it does it in a way where all of you can show up, both all of you as an individual and all of us as individuals can show up and participate in a safe and supportive environment. And ultimately, though, from my money, the reason why I really advocate for sociocracy is it's the way that you maximize your effectiveness. And I think we can all agree, the times they are a bumpy, and so we don't seem to have a lot of spare time and energy to waste on needless conflict or turf wars or misunderstandings or things that really get in the way of effective collaboration. And so sociocracy really helps us to be better at what it is we choose to do. So one of the principles that or the spirit that sociocracy has for me in the whole is the blind ones and the elephant, which if people are familiar with this, it's a parable from South Asia. And basically these blind men have never experienced an elephant before, and one comes to town and they all are led up to the elephant, but they all grab a different part. So one has the ear, one has the tusk, one has the tail, one has the legs. And they instantly start fighting about what's the true elephant. Is it sharp like a spear? Is it ropey like the tail? Is it big like a tree trunk for the one who held the legs? And what they don't realize is they're all right and they're all wrong. They all have a part of it, but none of them have the big picture. And sociocracy is a tool that allows us to show up as the blind ones in the elephant. We get to show up knowing what we know about the part that we hold, and we get to figure out how to put that together with the parts that other people hold. So it allows us to have our perspective, have our knowledge, and figure out how to contribute to all of our mutual benefit. So what I'm going to cover today, I'm going to go over where Sociocracy 3.0 comes from and the history of it. Sociocracy is actually a much older practice than most people know. So it has roots and it has applications already built into it. I'm going to go over what I think is the one core concept. If you retain only one thing from this workshop, it's the core concept of treat all of your projects and all of your decisions as a series of experiments. And we'll go over the principles that underlie the system, and then the process, some of the tools that you can use to apply to bring those principles into practice. And then there's a few different ideas and tools that don't really fit into the principles or the process, but are useful and as we're organizing ourselves. So I'll also go over those. And so to start the context and the history, as I said, there are many forms of sociocracy. They all have similar roots, which go back to early experiments with how to do democracy in small groups and quicker meeting practices. So from the very beginning, there's been an element of, I hope this doesn't freak anybody out, but a spiritual quality to how we come together, respecting more than just the work to be done. But the thing that is most often identified as sociocracy was really founded in 1970 by Gerald Endenberg in Europe somewhere. I want to I can't remember, a German-speaking place. And anyhow, he brought a bunch of things together and he used it as the way that he structured his business, which I believe is still in business. It became, they had hundreds of employees. It was quite a success. And they continue to use sociocracy as their organizing framework. So, and there have been, hundreds of other organizations, for-profit, nonprofit, large and small, that have applied sociocracy in various forms in the last 50 years. There have been some attempts at kind of refreshing sociocracy that have all happened since the 2000s. Holacracy is one form of it. You may have, if you have a day job in a corporate setting, you may have been exposed to holacracy. they tried to take sociocracy and basically make it appealing to large corporations. And in doing so, they actually lost a lot of the secret sauce of sociocracy. It's a very restricted application of how sociocracy works. Basically, it was trying to brand it and, capture the intellectual property. There's also Sociocracy for All, which is Ted Rao's project, and they've been around for 10 years or so, I think. And then there's the Sociocracy 3.0, which comes out of Europe. And that kind of influences how it's formulated. But the other thing that I quite like about Sociocracy 3.0 is that it incorporates a lot of lessons from agile project management and lean methodology. And lean methodology was basically a system for startups. How do you start on a shoestring with a good idea and a small workforce and leverage that and grow it? And so there was a lot of experiments were done using lean methodology. And likewise, agile project management is a system that developed in software developers in that kind of tech world, where they were constantly having to cycle new innovations really quickly. And the old ways of doing project planning, where you lay out your 3-year plan and then execute it, just don't work in that context. And so they needed some other way of working, and they developed this agile process. And it's a much more nimble way of keeping things on track, but allowing things to evolve as you develop feedback. So that's incorporated into the system. So there's a lot of different ideas that have come together into Sociocracy 3.0, and there's a lot of history. But ultimately, what sociocracy attempts to do is capture what already works. And so it isn't as though sociocracy is invented. It's actually just trying to catalog the tools and the techniques that are sort of tried and true in forward-looking, change-oriented groups. And so there's actually been a lot of research also gone into it, to identify what are the patterns that are associated with effective collaboration. And those are brought together in, it's a set of principles and practices. So the principles are really at a high level, what gives you that solid foundation to work on. And then the practices are like tools in a toolkit that you can bring out as needed. And so sociocracy tries to give you the toolkit with a little set of instructions. If you're experiencing this, pull out this tool. If you're experiencing this other thing, pull out this tool. And so, and then the system itself allows for adaptation. So it's very flexible, because you only need to use the tools that are right for you in that setting in your group. And as I said before, it also is Creative Commons licensing. And so there's an active promotion of taking the tools and refining them and keeping what works, refining them in a way that works for you. So keep what works. If you know of other tools in other systems that work for you, bring them in. This is not, there's no sort of gospel behind sociocracy. Ultimately, it's a set of tools that have worked for lots of other people with some instructions on how to apply them. So, and this is what happens when this is how Sociocracy 3.0 has organized the tools. We're not going to go through all of these. You wouldn't really need to go through all of these. They're sort of nested into categories, and the principles and the process that we're going to go over will direct you to the tool that you need when you need it. But again, the big idea is just that these are probably things that you've seen before. They're practices or processes that you may have experienced, and or similar to something you've already experienced. It's just a kit to bring it together, and with a little bit of sense of when some of the tools are more appropriate than others. So out of that toolkit, the one thing that pulls it all together is this idea of experimentation. And I consider myself a scientist, but my partner is an artist, and art and science have the same roots, which is we're trying to figure out how can we respond to the world as it is, rather than falling into sort of conditioned beliefs. And the reality is that that's how most humans make most of our decisions by habit. We don't actually make many decisions in a day. And even when we are thinking that we're making decisions, oftentimes we're just running with assumptions. We're running with old stories and old patterns. And there's a really good evolutionary reason for this, because making choices is really expensive. It's hard to make a choice. It requires a lot of energy. It requires a lot of effort. And the kind of going with your habits in the short term is always effective, and in stable environments is also really effective. The problem is that we know that a lot of our kind of habitual ways of thinking, just because of human nature, we are subject to biases and heuristics. Our brains tend to make mistakes in similar directions. We tend to focus on the negative more than the positive. We tend to assume that the way things have been is the way they're going to be. There's some assumptions that we make, which in stable situations are okay. But when you're in a changing context like we're in, it's worse than just inefficient. We end up recreating problems that we're trying to avoid. So this is really the situation that we find ourselves in, is in a way we can't trust our instincts. We can't trust our habitual ways of doing things because they've been warped a little bit. And so if we always keep doing what we've always done, we're going to keep getting what we got, right? So if we keep structuring committees and organizations the way we do, with top down and board of directors and a CEO who gets 100 times more than the bottom line, or the line workers, we're going to keep getting what we keep getting. So one of the challenges in moving to sociocracy isn't that anything to do with sociocracy is hard. It's just not what you're used to. And in implementing it in any group, that's going to be the biggest challenge. It's just not what you're used to. So in order to make that kind of easier to integrate, we can hang this all around one core concept, which is we're just going to challenge our assumptions by treating all of our decisions as though they're experiments. And we're going to test it out. We're going to make choices. We're going to make decisions the best we think we can, the best we can at the time. But then we're going to do it in a way where we know if it works or not. And that's the simplest version of an experiment, is we try something we think is going to work. We do our best, but we do it in a way where we are open to the idea that maybe it isn't working exactly the way we thought. So we're opening ourselves up for feedback based on what we're trying to accomplish. And what sociocracy is basically doing is creating a feedback mechanism, a process that just allows us, I always shorthand it as aim, act, reflect. So at any given time, we say, okay, here we are. Where are we now? Where do we want to be? What's the best thing that we can do to get there, we think? And what would it look like if it worked? And we write that down, and then we try it, and then we reflect. We pause every once in a while and say, is that working the way we thought it would? Yes or no? So that's really everything that we're here talking about, are just ways of organizing that understanding that we're testing everything as we go into an organizational system. So there's a both and here. We're trying to create some structure, but allow it to be adaptable. And so there's a bit of a balancing act. And treating things as an experiment creates the feedback loops that allow us to get that balance right. So the way we keep this all together, because we're trying to create space for innovation, but also create enough structure to keep chaos from happening. And one of the ways that we make that happen is by being clear on the grounding principles. And Sociocracy 3.0 has two sets of principles, and we're going to talk about each. There's the grounding principles, which are how, at a bottom line, are we going to work together? And we'll go over them. You'll see they're simple and straightforward and uncontroversial. Then there are 10 organizing principles, and they say, okay, now that we've got our ground, our foundation, how do we know what to do? How do we make decisions about what the focus is and who's going to do what? So these are the grounding principles. And they are, as I said, the whole idea behind sociocracy is we're just trying to pull out the best of our experiences. What do we know from experience works more consistently? And how do we code that in a way that we can understand it? We can remember it. One of the things I do as a consultant, almost always the first exercise I do with a new group is, and a lot of times I'm coming in trying to talk about collaboration. And I use something that's a tool from appreciative inquiry called a peak experience exercise. And in pairs, I have people talk about the best time you've ever had working with another group. Think about the best collaborative experience you've had, where it just hummed and everything was the way it should be. And now let's dissect that. Go under the surface. What was it? Pre-existing relationships, habits, structures, what allowed that moment to happen? And pretty much invariably, and so people get a chance to talk about their lived experience, and then we bubble up the answers and we say, what are some nuggets that we can pull from that experience that would help keep us on track? And the words are always different, but these 7 things are what come up consistently in the groups that I've worked with. So the first one is equivalence, and I think this is kind of the cornerstone. And it is, we involve people in the decisions that affect them. It's kind of a no-brainer, because if we don't involve people in the decisions that affect them, first of all, we're missing information because they know something that we don't know because of how they're affected by it. And if we don't deal with it up front, we're going to have to deal with it later if we get it wrong. So it's a sort of go slow to go fast principle. It just makes sense that we want to engage people who are going to be impacted by our decisions in that decision-making process. Now, of course, we want to do it effectively. So that comes down to the effectiveness at the bottom here in the middle. We all only want to spend our energy on things that are going to move us forward. So we want to involve people in those decisions, but we want to do it in a way that is effective and efficient. And one of the ways to do that is through a consent-based decision-making process. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we set that up, but ultimately, consent means that we are going to seek out objections before we make a decision. We're not going to avoid potential objections. We're not going to try to talk people out of objections. We're going to bring them up, and we're going to address them ahead of time, because that's actually when it's most efficient to address those objections. And almost always we can find ways of working with the objections. It's not the problem itself that comes up. It's actually that too often we don't create the space and time for those objections to come up. And again, we do it in the most effective way possible. So for that all to happen, transparency is also really important. And transparency is the idea that people should have access to the information that they need to make good decisions. And unless there are some things that we want to keep private, there are reasons to have privacy concerns. But the default is if it's useful to people, they should have access to that information so that they can get their work done as best as possible. The trick here is usually it's a lot of information is not the same as transparency, because it's making information available as people need it in a form that they can use. So the flip side, I'm just popping over to accountability. The bringing people in on decisions and making sure that we have consent on decisions is a way of allowing non-coercive agreements to develop. So no one is forced into anything in sociocracy. We come to terms that everyone can live with. Doesn't mean everyone's going to love everything, but everyone can live with it. They don't have an objection. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. It's good enough for now. It's safe enough to try. They can live with it. But then that only works if now people are also accountable to those agreements. And so, mean what you say and say what you mean and do what you say you're going to do is accountability. And one of the reasons I love working with the RJ program is accountability is also baked into restorative practices. If we can't follow up on our agreements and that leaves somebody else in the lurch, well, we need to do what we can to repair the harm that's been done. It's just basic restorative principles. And it's simple for most people. I mean, obviously we try to do what we say we're going to do. And mostly this is about being clear when you can't. When situations change, making it easy and possible for people to say, I thought I'd have this by Thursday and I can't, and I'm going to let you know as soon as I can so that you can make it, accommodations. The last two are also equally important, and they kind of link in with consent as well, in that empiricism is really this idea that we're going to test our assumptions. So it can be a tricky concept for some people, but it means we're going to turn everything into what does that look like if we're successful? We're going to come to terms that we can understand. What does that look like if it's happening in the room? And that allows us then, it's much easier to assess if we're moving in the right direction, the clearer we can get on what it would look like if it happened in the room. And similarly, because we don't know exactly what it would look like if it's happening in the room for most of the things that we're talking about. How do we have social support? What does social support look like in the room? Well, it can look like a lot of things, right? Or what does an inclusive community look like? Well, it can look like lots of things. So that's why we're also involved in continuous improvement. And it's not just the experiments, but it's linking the experiments together into a chain. So that means it's the Maya Angelou quote, we do as good as we can until we know better, and then we do better. And so we use the experiments to figure out when we know better, and then we do better. So those are the grounding principles. Those are sort of saying this is, how we have to approach the work together. But then the organizing principles say, okay, so now how do we put that all in motion? How do we animate that and those concepts? And they come in, I love this graphic, by the way, this kind of bullseye. And it's really well thought out. In the center, the thing that keeps our focus is a clear purpose and a clear strategy. So the purpose is, where are we going? What are we trying to accomplish? What would it look like if we were successful? And then the strategy is, in big, bold steps, how are we going to get there? What do we think the change in the world that we can make that will produce this outcome looks like? So those two things keep us on focus. And then we need to navigate as events warrant. So there are three principles for navigation. The first is a focus on value, and I like to phrase this as return on effort. So many of us have heard of the Pareto principle or the 80-20 rule, which is consistently, and from our own experience, you can kind of feel into this. A lot of times there are a small number of things that we do that actually get most of the work done. They really get us most of the way towards the finish line. And then we can waste a whole lot of time, 80% of our effort, on that last little fiddly bit. And there's lots of different ways of sort of describing this. But the concept underneath is, if we really focus on the 20 that gets us 80, the stuff that seems to move us further forward faster, then the more that we make that a habit, the more effective we're going to be. And so we do that by running the experiments, and that lets us actually get a better sense, a clearer sense of, are we getting what we think we're going to get from the effort? And in order for that to be effective, we have to sense into and respond to what we're learning from the experiments. So the way that this gets put into practice is we prioritize what are the things short term right now that we can be doing that are going to boost our performance, are going to move us further forward. Then we set them up like a little experiment. I recommend 3 months as a good frame of reference for the size of experiments that really animate the system well. And then at the end of the 3 months, we're going to pause and say, how'd that work? What worked well? Let's do more of that. What didn't work so well? Let's let go of that. And what are some things we can tweak? So that's the whole of the system. So we need a container for that system, right? We need some structures around that constant experimentation. The purpose and the strategy is going to keep us aimed in the right direction, but then we also need a way of sort of containing that creativity and potential. So here it's a balancing act. We want to enable autonomy, innovation, passion. We want to enable what people have and want to contribute, but we want to minimize the possibility of inadvertent conflict. You know, we've all been in those situations where we're running forward with something and somebody else is running forward with something entirely different, and we don't know about it until, oh, look, we just invented the wheel together. You know, that there's all that wasted effort. Or where one hand is undoing what the other hand is trying to do, and you don't realize that you're working at cross purposes. So what we want to do is the lightest possible structure that allows us to avoid unnecessary conflict. And then there are beyond that container, there is the worldview that lets this kind of work. And it's really about how do we move away from command control, the customer is always right thinking, towards peer-to-peer and collaborative thinking. So one of the things that we need to do is invest the time and energy in what Roland says is learning to unlearn so that we can relearn. So when we're investing in learning, what we're kind of equally investing in taking the time to be a bit intentional, taking the time to reflect and make sure that we're doing things the way we want to be doing, but also taking the time to winkle out some of those old habits that we have, like especially when we get a little stressed or in a jam. So we're shifting the culture of what it is to work with each other. And partly we do that by talking constantly and consistently about what is this thing that we're creating together. So how do we have conversations? And this is where Circle is, you know, a really effective tool. The kinds of conversations that we can have in the circle, where we can talk about what is the possibility, what does hold us back, how do we want to be with each other. That's what we want to make a routine part of how we work together, because it has a practical outcome that we start to share a more clear picture of how we're all working together. We get a better sense of the elephant. We get a better sense of how the tusk connects to the tail. We can connect that chain of experience. So we have all these principles. We've got our 7 grounding principles and our 10 organizing principles, but how do we do that? So the process as laid out in Sociocracy is this. You can start anywhere in the circle, and the circle is never ending. But usually the place we start is by identifying a tension. And attention, oh yes, this is my shorthand for this. The 5-step circle is just aim, act, reflect, repeat. And most of the time we're going to come in because tensions present themselves. So a tension in Sociocracy is defined as an embodied feeling. You feel a tension. There are lots of synonyms for tensions. It could be a frustration. It could be a challenge. It could be a problem. It could also be positive. It could be a hope. It could be a desire to see a particular thing come into being. But there's a feeling to it, often a sense of kind of frustration or challenge. And we recognize it in Sociocracy as simply the gap between how we think the world could be and how it currently is. And unlike our normal business as usual way of working, we don't privilege one or the other. We often get stuck in this sort of debate about, well, do we either have to cynically accept the world as it is, or is the world wrong and it should be the dream we have of how it could be? In sociocracy, we say both are true. The world is the way it is right now, less than my ideal, and I have ideas about how it could be better. It doesn't mean the world's wrong, and it doesn't mean my ideas are right. It means my ideas are interesting, and the world is interesting, and what do we do with that? So we just treat the gap between the experience and expectations as a source of information, a place for learning. And the way we do that learning is that we go under the surface of the tension and we talk about the drivers. So the drivers are the deep motivations, the deep social forces, the things that actually are giving life to the tension that you're seeing. And a lot of times, actually almost always, drivers come in dynamic pairs. So one that I constantly use as an example is action versus planning. And often in groups, we get into these debates. Some people say, oh, we don't want to waste time on planning. We should just do something. And then other people say, oh, we can't just run around doing things. We've got to actually have a plan. And we frame it as though it's either or, as though it's either better to act or it's better to plan. And the reality, of course, is there's a balance. There is enough planning that we are avoiding obvious mistakes and obvious conflicts. And there's enough action that we're actually making some progress in the world. We don't want to fall into only planning analysis paralysis, and we don't want to fall into kind of a rat in a maze kind of activity where we just keep running and not really making any progress. So it's the driver in this case is the need for planning and the need for action, both and. And so once we start to identify that the drivers are in this dynamic pair, the choices become, where do we want to position ourselves? How much planning is enough planning? How much action is too much action? And it becomes a lot easier in the group to sort of set your dials rather than having the argument about either or. Once you've identified the drivers, then you can start being generative about solutions. How do we find that middle spot, that sweet good zone? And I'm not going to go over the whole idea of developing a proposal, but it does basically start with, first of all, we want to make sure that we're talking about the same problem. So we really talk about the driver, what's under the surface here. Then we gather considerations, which is a process of basically saying, what do we already know about this? And then we brainstorm and prioritize ideas. So what's the so what? How do we do something about this? We write that up in a proposal, and it just has a number of parts that drive why are we doing this? Who's going to do what? Who are we saying is responsible? What would it look like? What are we actually going to do? Excuse me. And and how will we know if we're successful? So those are the basic elements of a proposal. Once you've developed the proposal, what we need to do is make agreements, make sure that we're all on the same page. And so that's where the consent process works. So I think this is a sign I've gone on too long. Consent means that we take our proposals and we seek out potential objections or concerns. In sociocracy, we are careful about language on the difference between a concern and an objection. A concern is basically, I'm not crazy about that. I wouldn't like it. It's not my preference. I'm worried something bad might happen, but it's, who knows. An objection, on the other hand, is something that is not good enough for now, is not safe enough to try. It's something that exposes us to too much risk or keeps us from doing it in a way that could be so much more effective. So when you're shopping the proposal around, by seeking out the concerns and objections, you're actually fine-tuning and improving the proposal. And there's an assumption that People who raise objections also have a responsibility, part of the accountability, to propose friendly amendments that will keep the value of the original proposal, but address the objection. And it becomes then again a collaborative. It's not a good or bad, right or wrong, yours or mine. It's about co-creating and evolving the proposals to the point that everyone can live with it. Once you get to that point, you celebrate and you write it down. And including, you'll notice in the agreement template here, all of the concerns that were raised along the way in refining the proposal, you want to have a reference to those. You want to have them on your radar because you want to respect that they are legitimate concerns. And so as you're moving forward, part of that experiment is making sure that those concerns don't come to pass. So that's basically the whole part of the process. You make once you make the agreement, you do it. People do what they say they're going to do, and then you pause to reflect, and that brings you back to the IDing the tensions. So as soon as you're in the reflection mode, reflection by its nature is comparing what you expected and what you experienced. So it's going to highlight those tensions. Where were things didn't go according to plan? What do we do better next time? Right? You're feeding that right back into the proposal process. So that's kind of the core of it. The principles then get put into motion through that aim, act, reflect process, going into identifying the tensions, looking for the drivers, understanding the deeper motivations, brainstorming a so what, how do you respond to that, and then doing it in a way, picking the best example, doing it as an experiment, feeding that learning back into your next set of actions. So that's the core concept. Everything else is just details to kind of figure out along the way. And there are a couple other ideas that I think are really useful as we're leading groups. One is the idea of being able to differentiate governance from operations. And governance is really the generative questions. What's this all about? What's the best way of moving forward? What's the best use of our resources? Operations then is how do you get the stuff done? How do you make sure people aren't overburdened, that the tasks are equally shared, that you have the resources necessary to get things done where they need to get done. So that's something that's baked into the organizing structure in sociocracy. And it's also a really useful distinction. So we separate out tensions that are governance tensions and operational tensions, and we treat them slightly differently. It's the same basic process, but one has much more focus and one is more, sort of abstract. Just useful language. The other thing that I think is an important idea to take from sociocracy is we are always delegating influence or authority, if you want to use the old language, from the whole to agents who are better suited to get it done. So when we are organizing our organizations, the organization is handing off the responsibility to one of the circles or to an agent to do it, but the ultimate authority is always with the whole. So this is intended to minimize siloing and how, sometimes you can hand things off to a subgroup and the subgroup forgets that it's part of the whole, that it's only doing what it's doing for the benefit of the whole. And one of the ways that you do that is by establishing domains. And the way I always think about this is it's treating the organization like an organism. And organisms have organs that help it function. So the domains are like the functional organs of an organization. So the heart has a job, the heart has to beat, and the heart can't do that job if it isn't also connected to the kidneys and the lungs and the brain. So those organs only work well when they work together and they recognize the interconnections between them. So when you're establishing your org chart, basically, rather than thinking in terms of pyramids, you're thinking in terms of organs. and what are the interconnections between the different functions of the area. So just as an example, this is the Lifeboat Academy. This is our guild system. So these are our organs. And part of what we did to establish the organs is we also looked at how resources, information, products flow from one organ to another. And that's something that's built into the domain itself. So when you're taught, when you establish, we call them guilds, other people call them circles. But when you establish your circles, they have a driver statement, and that driver statement includes what are the other functional areas that you have an interdependency with, and how do we expect you to navigate that interdependency. So rather than sort of drawing clear circles and saying, you know, finance is finance and HR is HR, we look for those interconnections, and we make sure that the lines of communication are clear between those circles. So that idea of domains as organs in an organism, I think, is really useful. And the other thing too that's useful as a set of tools is, again, that's kind of where the agile project management comes into the system. There are some handy tricks for how to distribute work in a way that is fair and non-coercive. And one of them is called the pool system for work. In a nonprofit, in a volunteer organization, you almost always pool work anyhow, because it's who's willing to do this. There are very few of us have the leverage over the volunteers enough to actually hand things to them. But when the other thing that's also really important in this whole system is limiting the amount of work we're taking on at any time. And this is really nothing to do with sociocracy, but it is such an important organizational habit, because especially our small nonprofits, we get really excited, we're really passionate, we want to save the world, and we just get excited and we take on too much. And then everyone starts getting burnout, everyone starts feeling overwhelmed. So there also are some practical tools baked into the sociocracy that you limit the amount of work that you're taking on at any given time, which also is supported by the idea of these 3-month experiments, because you can plan a lot more effectively for these shorter sprints than you can for, you know, a whole year or more. And that's basically, those are the points that I wanted to cover. There's a lot of pieces and parts, but the thing that I want you to, there's a couple things that I hope you take away with you. You don't need to know all of this to start to apply some of the tools. And in fact, Sociocracy 3.0 says, don't try to apply all of them. Figure out where there might be something that would help your organization along, your team along, and do that one thing, make that one change, and see how that goes. You know, actually use that experimental approach in how you adopt Sociocracy. A lot of these, they're really simple ways of doing, like gathering considerations. You can do in any group at the drop of a hat. You don't even really have to tell your group what they're doing, and you will be impressed at how easy it makes a decision-making process. So a lot of these are just kind of one-off tools that you could just sort of drop in a meeting. But know that the whole toolkit is designed so that as you start picking up a tool here and a tool there, there's other supports, and there's ways that they become mutually supporting. So start where you are, you know, keep it simple, keep it light, and know that there are resources that you can draw on when you get there, when you need it. Yeah, so I think that's basically it. I'm going to open the floor up for questions, but I did want to point out, so Sociocracy Sociocracy's website is sociocracy30.org, and they have some fantastic resources on there, and it's all Creative Commons licensing. We also, the Lifeboat Academy has a help desk on Freshdesk, so lifeboatacademy.freshdesk.com. And an earlier presentation that I did on Sociocracy is already up on the help desk. So if you wanted to, you could review what I'm talking about here. And you can also ask questions for the help through the help desk if there's anything in particular that we don't get to cover now, or if you're watching this video. And likewise, we are always available for coaching. If you're interested in thinking about how you might want to apply sociocracy or some tools from it, I'd love to chat with you about it. I work on the gift economy, so there's no charge. I'll just ask you if I create any value, if you would be willing to pay it forward. And you can also contact us through friends at the Lifeboat Academy. So, like I said, this is a very unusual process for me to do just the sort of the lecture, but there's a lot of material there, and I just wanted to make sure that kind of covered the basics. And so now, questions, comments, reactions. And I guess probably just raise a hand to keep things sorted. Patrick? And you're muted.
All right. The Lifeboat Academy, is it actually about physical lifeboats or?
No.
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 Okay. I thought not.
No, we define a lifeboat as a personal local resilience network. So we're helping people build their lifeboats by building their local networks of support. Any other questions, comment? Oh, Jim, you had something. You're muted as well.
There we go. Ben, it's wonderful to see how we've incorporated many of the sociocratic principles in our particular organization, our circle of the community justice program. And a lot of it has been almost organic. We didn't pick up from a structure and say, we're going to do this and this and this in order to, but we just started with the circle process. And as a result of that, we've seen some of the tensions that happened around that. Part of it is, and I think you've described it as the circle in the square, is that we're operating under this particular structure in our own program, and yet we are working within structures such as grants, that require us to follow a particular structure. Umbrella organizations that have that work in other ways with the boards, and one of the things that keeps coming up is time constraints. Is that there's something about the efficiency of having a top-down type of structure where you have someone that's saying, okay, we've got to get this in by tomorrow, and if you don't come up with something, then we're going to have to do this. So one of the great challenges and one of the tensions we feel in our program is the circle in the square. So I just want to see if you have other things to say about that.
Oh yeah, I mean that is a real constraint, and that's always going to be there. It's going to be there when you're bringing new people in. If you choose to do sociocracy, most people won't have heard of it when they come in, and so you're going to have to figure out how to bring them up to speed on a different way of working. The good news is that once people don't have to understand it to appreciate it. There are, and in many ways, like Jim was saying, what we did in the community justice program naturally morphed towards something like sociocracy. And only because we just started that's why I'm saying if you take away only one thing, it's treat everything as a series of experiments. What can we try? What moves us in the direction that we want to go in? And how can we learn from that? And it doesn't matter what your context is, how square your square is and how round your circle is. Just starting there and saying, well, what could we try? What's one thing that moves us in that direction? And the other thing too is the other advantage of this is it is an evidence-based reality testing way of working. It is my version of it is anti-conceptual. Even sociocracy itself, you don't have to use that name. You don't have to adopt all the principles. You can change the name. You can call it what, works for you. But it's about how do you get it done, right? How are you actually moving towards your goals in a way where you're moving towards your goals? So it also counteracts, we got to do it the old way because it's more effective. It's not. I mean, and if the old way were more effective, we wouldn't be in this mess, right? Like this is part of the challenge, is getting people to recognize there's common research that $1 invested in prevention is worth $7 of reacting to problems. But our organizations are set up as though it's the other way around. We invest all of our money on the short-term problem, and none of our money on the prevention and improvement and reflection. And that's why we're getting further and further behind, because we don't pause to stop and say, well, what's really the most effective thing here? Is it more effective to exclude people who later on are going to find out about this decision because it affects them and have a hissy fit? Is it more effective to, is it more effective to wait till the 11th hour and then have somebody come in and torpedo it? Is that more effective? Or is it more effective to enter into a competition with the guy down the road who now you're going to piss off and, is going to fight against you? Or is it more effective to figure out how you collaborate? It takes longer to figure out how to collaborate, but it's way more effective, So we need to learn how to start making that argument. And again, like with sociocracy, you don't have to sell anyone on sociocracy. I would recommend you just start to introduce some of the tools where they might help. And then once, it's like with Circle, once you get people into the Circle and experiencing the Circle, they want more of it. And this is the same thing. Once you start to introduce some of these peer-to-peer, non-coercive ways of working together, people like it because everyone gets to show up and feel good about what they contribute, and no one's browbeating anybody else into feeling guilty. That's nicer. So, and you get better retention and you get better results from your staff. So it's really efficient. It's really effective, but it's a different way of thinking. So anyhow, it was a bit of my thank you, Jim, for providing my soapbox. It's the view from up here is quite nice. Now you're muted. You just.
I wasn't set up for that question. I promise you.
Any other comments, questions, Patrick?
Yeah, can you give us a few examples of projects? Like you said, this is a method for, say, something that has limited resources and maybe only a couple of people. They have a big vision, they want to go about accomplishing some substantial goals. So can you give us a few examples of projects like that?
Well, I mean, Lifeboat Academy, we've been applying sociocracy for quite a while, and actually a lot of I work with a provincial network of networks, and we've been sneaking in sociocracy into how they work, and getting people to that's a bad example because it requires too much context. Well, actually, community justice. We started off getting trained. So the evolution of community justice was originally it's an RJ program. One of the consistent tensions that the previous incarnations of the community justice program had was you have to wait around for referrals, and there weren't many. And so you get everyone trained and everyone interested and everyone up to speed, and then nothing happened. And it's really hard to maintain interest. So, well, that kept happening. How do we do it different? Well, the group of us that started said, well, why are we waiting till there's an incident? Why aren't we working upstream a little bit and starting to create the kind of community where, that just where somebody would deal with a youth in restorative ways anyhow? So we got trained. I'm not really sure how we got connected with Evelyn, but she came in and trained us in the circle process. And we all kind of said, this is fantastic. How do we do this? And then we just started and it was COVID hit. We had all sorts of big plans about in-person meetings on all the islands and COVID. So then okay, now how do we respond to that? Well, we regrouped and we figured out how to do a Zoom circle. And no one told us how to do a Zoom circle. We just figured out how to do a Zoom circle. And we tried them, and we had a couple people show up for the first time, and we kept doing them. And now we have more people that come back more regularly. And now, because of that, people in organizations on different islands are reaching out to us to say, we've got some conflict. How can you help us? So, you know, the community justice program is a living example of, we just did a little thing, and what could we learn from that? Every time we did a community circle, we debriefed what worked, what didn't, how do we do that better? And every project we did, we debriefed. And I mean, I don't know, it's kind of patting ourselves on the back, but I think we've grown the project in a really important way in a relatively short time. And we've only really been at this like 4 years, right? 4 or 5 years. So there, that would be the example. Anybody else have a question or a comment?
Yeah. 2 thoughts. One is, I remember what they were now. One of them is that implicit in what, this is really exciting, and thank you, by the way. It's quite insightful. Where I've seen this applied in a number of cases is you get into complex research situations. My experience is about 10 years old, and you're probably light years ahead of me now. But certainly where you get people from so many different disciplines, you may have people who are award winners in their science or professions, and you're working with illiterate farmers. You get this kind of diversity, and many of these ideas have to be applied in that setting where you have a huge knowledge gap within the participants, and elements of what you're suggesting have actually worked pretty well for us. The second thing is that we've been experimenting a little bit in another sort of Gulf Islands wide program. And one of the things that comes out in my mind is there needs to be a certain code of ethics. Maybe it's implicit in what you're saying, but for example, if you reach an agreement, if people are apathetic, some people are apathetic or they outwardly oppose it, you never know where the experiment will work. So there has to be a willingness to do to apply yourself, even if it wasn't quite what you thought we should be doing. If you don't do that, you can't run your experiment. And I guess the third comment is it really an experiment if it's not replicated? I mean, I think of the scientific component of it.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it's if there's no replication, it's may not hold up to scientific scrutiny. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. But anyway, it's really exciting, and thank you for making this available to us.
Well, I'll work through your points in the order. Yeah, you're right. There is an implied ethics. Actually, there isn't an implied ethics. There is one of the components is very similar to the circle process, where you establish your agreements, your collective agreements about how you're going to work together. So just like the organs of the organism have a driver statement, the organization has a driver statement. And when you sign on to the organization, you're signing on to those agreements. And so you can go and look at the Lifeboat Academy's driver statement. It lists our purpose, our multiple purposes, and our agreements and our sociocracy principles. And basically, if you come into the system, and we onboard people to that, we're very, very clear. This is what drives us. This is what it means to be part of this organization. Can you live with it? And if you can't, let's talk about it. you know, and with the agreements are always alive. So we talk about the oral tradition. We know that it's a moving target about how we create the environment that's going to work for everyone. So we're always willing to revisit the agreement. So those ethical questions are kind of, again, baked in to the system from the very beginning, including a restorative justice aspect. I think that's, for me, I would add on, I don't think there's a lot in the Sociocracy 3.0 stuff about what do you do when there's a problem. You navigate the tension, and that's a good process. But this is where I think the CJ group, like, we bring this restorative lens about, you know, and it's not just about, it's about repairing the relationship. So what does the affected party and the responsible party, you know, what are they willing to commit to do to bring things back into balance? And part of it being non-coercive is, you know, that no one has to come in, like with the Lifeboat Academy, you don't have to agree to our agreements. We'll still find a way of working together in a different way. But if you want to be part of us, you have to agree to these agreements. And then, so, you know, it's, again, it's this balancing act of there's no judgment, but this is what it takes for us. Well, the way we actually frame our agreements is, what do you need to be present and show up? And if you can answer that question, I want everyone I'm working with to be able to be present and show up. And if they can't show up, that's a problem. So I need to know what they need from me and from us and from themselves so that they can show up. And again, it's a moving target because people are always figuring out, I mean, I think I know what I need to show up. And then it turns out I need something else. And so anyhow, it's a really important question. And I think that it's answered by the culture, right? It's answered by establishing and talking about how do we want to be with each other. And there will be people, we've already had people who can't work this way. And we've learned actually to say, well, this is how we work. And, you know, if you can't, and, you know, if you can't agree to accountability, hi, you know, so you can't agree to consent. Okay, okay, let me know how that works for you. So anyhow, and in terms of the scientific method, there is actually replicability, because what you're experimenting with is the process that you want to keep. So it gets replicated. A lot of times these experiments are again and again, like our community conversations. We have a template. So part of when we're early on, we would make changes to the template based on the feedback from the session. And now we use that template when we set up another community conversation. So I think I just cut out, everyone froze.
No, no,
Okay, good.
Okay.
we're all good.
All right, yeah, replicability is important, and it's also there. It's not, you know, we can have a debate over some wine about pure science. And any other questions, comments, additions? Rosabella?
I just wanted to add a little bit to the idea of replicability. Does that imply that if it were to be easy to replicate, that it could also become formulaic and therefore lose some of the creativity?
Yeah, but this is where navigating the tensions is your get out of jail free card, because no matter what, there's going to be something different. Something will come up and it will kind of nudge you back into responding to the new challenge. So I think ideally you'd love it to get to the point where it's so formulaic that you kind of fall into it. But usually in any kind of change work, you know, if you're effective, you're changing things. So you're going to constantly moving the goalposts, right? Because if you're effective in doing the work, then you're going to invite bigger challenges, and you're going to have to scale differently, or you're going to bring it to a new audience, or you're going to bring it to a different situation. So even if you kind of get it where you're trusting it, the different kind of circumstances are going to test it. Other comments, questions, observations? Awesome.
Well, I've got so much to say, but
Yeah, well, and I do want to say I have been toying with sociocratic kinds of tools for probably 15 or 20 years now. And I've applied it in a lot of different settings, and I would be more than happy to talk with anybody about how it might be applicable to something that you're working on. And
Okay.
you know, no matter the scale. So
Okay. Okay.
yeah, I'm available.
All right.
yeah. Oh, I want to close it out by saying how fortunate we are to have Ben as part of our community justice program, and as being a Southern Gulf Islander, and the project you're working on with the Lifeboat Project is inspirational. I encourage everyone to check it out. And at the same time, I'm really tempted, and I'm going to do it. Okay, just go with me here. I want to do a classic circle thing and do just a quick checkout, if that's okay.
Sure.
And I'm going to I'm going to start it. I'm going to move past Ben, give Ben the last word, but just one or two words to that reflect on what you've heard tonight. Some takeaways that you might have, that you might be thinking about. And I'm going to start with Bev, because you're the first person on my screen on the right.
Unfortunately, I had to keep ducking out during most of the presentation, but I'm looking forward to checking notes with Dawn. And yeah, the concept's great.
Okay, Don, you were here the whole time.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll summarize my questions, my comments. Yeah, I think it's really neat, and I'm just really grateful for the opportunity. I don't want to give a lecture right now, but let me say thank you.
And on to Barbara. Oh, I think you're muted there. Okay. If you're okay, we can come back to you if you want, or okay, we'll come back to you, Barbara. I'll move on to Melody.
Well, I think one of the reasons I came was because this came up in a regenerative leadership program that I was taking about decision making and regenerative leadership. And so this is why I was very interested to hear the different perspectives or the different ideas about how to come to decisions and working with teams, working within coming to common goals. And so, yeah, so that was great. And I'd love to talk more with you about this, Ben, because I've looked at your Lifeboat Academy, and that's one of the things I'd like to kind of learn a little bit more about. So
Anytime, love to.
We'll move back to Barbara. I think you're unmuted now.
Oh, oh,
Right.
you didn't hear anything I said.
No, you were
Oh
muted.
gosh, sorry. Yeah, what I was mentioning that just one thing I enjoyed hearing about the gap between expectations and experience in this process. I worked in the Yukon. I went up there 40 years ago, and we were into restorative justice then, and it had been happening for some time. And we did a lot of circle sentencing. And so unfortunately, through a lot of the presentation, I was trying to apply what was being said to the process that we were doing up there. So it's kind of a parallel process for me. And perhaps in some ways, there's just a little bit of a difference in the wording, you know, and that happens over a 40-year period, I
Mhm.
realize.
Mhm.
So it was a journey for me this last hour.
Mhm.
Sentimental journey, maybe.
Mm.
I look forward to talking to you more about this, but very cool. Thank you. Jonas, thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah, I joined one of the community circles on Main Island, and when I saw this being presented, I was very interested and intrigued by it because yeah, I'm currently working for a small lab at UVic, and I'm thinking of joining some of the NGOs on Main and just yeah, seeing how I can apply these more collective or like communal strategies on yeah, solving problems and connecting. And yeah, I really enjoyed the presentation, but I also have to say that I had a very long work day today, so my brain was a bit on just like complete sponge mode and taking in everything and I'm excited to like look back at some of my notes and maybe reach out then to you, Ben. I think we might have lost some people.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so.
We lost a few.
Yeah.
And it just
Yeah,
said that I'm the host.
Yeah.
Oh,
What?
I think I think the power may have gone out because my lights flickered. I don't know if
Oh my gosh.
Oh my
yeah.
goodness. Well, because
Oh,
Ben is
wow.
gone and Jim is gone and
And
Melody.
Jim's gone. Yeah,
Oh,
and Bev
well.
and Dawn. Oh my goodness.
Oh my
It's
goodness.
just we're left holding.
Oh, so it's just it was all Pender. Everybody on. Oh no, except Daisy.
I'm guessing
Daisy's on Pender. Yeah.
Yeah.
well, maybe it was Shaw because I don't have Shaw and they
Not
may
you and not you, Annette. The other Shaw.
No, not me, Shaw. Oh well.
I
Well,
do have
I
my Shaw.
Yeah, I know. Well, I enjoyed it too. It was quite a lot to take in. I mean, I'm just
Really?
talking to all of you, a
Yeah.
lot to digest, but
Yeah.
it feels quite revolutionary and inspiring, like the way
Uh-huh.
the world should be.
Uh-huh.
So I
Uh-huh.
just I want to know more, and I like the idea of picking individual tools out and applying it bit by bit to different situations. That's something I could handle. I don't think I could learn the whole thing right away, but
Mhm.
yeah. What about you,
Quite
Daisy?
Quite amazing.
Yeah, same thing. Lots and lots of stuff. But I like it that they said just try little things, right? And just this.
Yeah.
I also like that at one point he said just treat everything like an experiment.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
wouldn't that be a fun way just to do everything? So that's what I'm going to do. Oh my goodness. Ben did text me and he does say that he's just waiting for the Wi-Fi to come back. So I don't know. How are you guys all feeling? Do you want to end your night?
Yeah,
I had
probably.
to go.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, probably.
I
Yeah.
have to get up. I've been sitting too long. But it's
Oh.
nice. It's nice to meet you. Is it
Yeah.
Jonas?
Jonas.
Yeah.
Jonas, hi, nice to meet you. I'm on
Nice to meet you.
Galliano, and Barbara's on Galliano. Hi, Barbara.
Hi, Annette.
Hi.
Cher voisine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
chère voisine. Yeah. Anyway, no, I think
yeah.
I'm gonna sign off, but
Uh-huh.
did he say to wait? He was hoping we'd wait?
No, I think we should just call
Yeah.
it an evening.
I think so.
Quite amazing. Yeah, wonderful. Too bad I didn't get to say thanks to Ben, but thank you, Ben.
Yeah.
It was really amazing. Ben does everything so well, and this was no exception.
He's
really great.
so articulate.
Anyways,
yeah.
lovely to see you all. Nice
It
to
was
meet
really-
you, Jonas. Nice to meet you,
Yeah.
Barbara. And we
You
will
too.
see you again. Jonas, maybe we'll see you on Saturday.
Maybe.
I hope so. Hope
Yeah.
so. Yeah. Okay. Take care.
Night, everyone.
Night, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.